In tactical command, Rear Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner, who had been agitating for a sea command since the beginning of the war, would supervise the amphibious operations against the islands. Major General A. Vandergrift of the Marines would head the troops ashore. McCain's planes would operate from landing bases in his area. MacArthur would offer aerial and submarine support from the Southwest Pacific. By July 7th, 3 of the 4 task forces were committed to the Tulagi operation, as the Japanese continued to land troops and workmen on Guadalcanal for their airfield. Nimitz was as busy as a midshipman on his first cruise, occupied with logistical problems, command issues, and the responsibility of shoring up all his other defences so the Japanese could not sneak in and attack him when he was not looking. He felt particularly exposed at Midway and moved to strengthen that position. The problem was still that there was so little to work with, and it was needed in so many places. McCain needed bombers, so Nimitz sent him 35 B-17s from Hawaii, then learned that the War Department would not or could not replace the defences for Hawaii. Nimitz told McCain this sad truth. Therefore, I think we must face an indefinite period during which calls for help will get little response from home. Nimitz had some bad news for McCain. There had been a delay in forming and training 4 Marine squadrons, and only 1 fighter and 1 dive bomber squadron would be ready to move in August. The other 2 squadrons would come 2 weeks later, after the operation began. The good news: Nimitz had talked to Major General Harmon, the Army airman, when he came through Pearl Harbor, and Harmon understood that McCain was to be in charge of the air components in the South Pacific. "I feel sure you will work harmoniously together," wrote Nimitz, making one of his typical bad puns. Yes, even when harried by 1,000 details, Nimitz was able to keep his sense of humour. On July 26th, for example, Nimitz spent a regular day at the office. He dealt with his staff meeting in the morning and absorbed the depressing news that Halsey would not be back with him before the middle of September. He made the decision to fleet Fitch up to Vice Admiral and make him commander of carriers in the Pacific, and eventually commander of all air activities. Murray, the carrier captain, would become Rear Admiral in charge of Task Force 17. Nimitz held several discussions with Spruance, his chief of staff, and then got into the big black Buick sedan that was his staff car and went off to Honolulu to attend a wedding. He returned just as his dinner guests arrived, Lieutenant J.G. James E. Bassett, Jr., and 2 young intelligence officers. They stalled to give him a moment to himself, and then went up the triple flight of stone steps to the house on the edge of the crater. The young officers came in, past the Marine Guard, who gave them a smart salute, and were led to the Admiral by a Filipino. "Let me know when upstairs is ready," Nimitz said, and the houseboy nodded. Nimitz then took his young guests outside to inspect the livestock, which consisted of 4 mongooses, trapped by the steward for stuffing purposes, and an island dog of uncertain ancestry. Nimitz had a tale for them. One evening, not long before, he had invited 3 flag officers to dinner, but had forgotten to tell Perez, his steward, that they were coming. Dinner that night was skimpy, and Perez was upset, but said that he would go out and rustle up something for them. He did. "We ate it," Nimitz said with a grin. Next morning a mongoose, stuffed, appeared on the sideboard in the dining room. "We never knew," the Admiral said. As Nimitz finished the tale, in came Perez to announce that upstairs was ready, and the Admiral asked his juniors if they would like a drink. They walked by the Admiral's work table, a drawing board set on sawhorses, where he toyed with Pacific area charts. "Hobby," he laughed as they passed. Then they went to the second deck and to a small blacked-out room at the head of the ladder. In it stood 5 small straight chairs and a desk. On the desk were a bucket of cracked ice, a bottle of bitters, slices of lemon and orange, a jar of maraschino cherries, and a tray of canapes. The Admiral sat down and looked at his guests keenly from beneath the white brows. "Bourbon or OK?" he asked. Bassett asked for bourbon. The others took OK, which was okulehu, a very strong Hawaiian liquor. Nimitz made the drinks and handed them around. "Luckily," Bassett said later, We had been warned about the boss's cocktails, so we hadn't fortified ourselves beyond a small beer base or mattress for what followed. They had a second drink, strong as a mule's kick, and then Admiral Spruance came in. He picked up a cup of tomato juice, which was waiting for him, and added a pinch of salt. Nimitz asked him if he wanted a dash of oak. "No," Spruance said. "I don't think OKE would be good. Causative and curative in one drink. No, not good." With the drinks, they talked, and Nimitz proved himself a fine host and commander, talking on the level of his junior officers. The young men opened up enough to discuss the idea of bringing a USO troop to the islands, and ran into one of Nimitz's prejudices: women in the war zone. "Well," he growled, "when Emmons, the army general in command of Hawaii, gives out a signed statement that he figures this place is safe enough so that non-essential people don't have to leave, then I'll okay these movie stars coming out, but not until—" They talked of the 9,000 young men of Japanese ancestry on the island. Nimitz said he thought they ought to be in uniform, sent to Africa or some other fighting front where they would not fight Japanese. "They're good fighters," he said. The discussion came to Japanese submarines. There was no reason in the world why a Japanese submarine could not come in some night, surface, throw 25 or 30 shells into Pearl Harbor installations, submerge, and get out. "We'd never catch her," Nimitz said thoughtfully. The others scoffed. "I could do it," Nimitz said. Spruance again demurred. "We don't know whether the Japanese are capable of it," he said. Nimitz grunted. "Hell, we don't know what their submarine motives are. I think they're more interested in reconnaissance than sinkings." Just then, another Filipino mess boy appeared at the head of the ladder and nodded. Nimitz nodded back, and they tossed off the last of their cocktails and went down the ladder. Dinner was beef stroganoff, Nimitz having just received the recipe from one of his daughters on the mainland. Then came the dessert, which was avocado ice cream. "I could have done without that," Bassett said. After dessert came coffee and cigarettes, and Nimitz began telling stories. He told a story about 3 Chinese girls who wanted men with dragons on their chests. He told a tale of the young marine parachutist who was going to make his first jump. The boy was scared, but his sergeant told him not to worry, just to pull the ripcord and everything would be all right. If the chute didn't open, the marine was to pull the ripcord on the emergency chute. And then, when he came down, he would be met by a station wagon and taken back to camp. So the marine jumped. He pulled the first cord, and nothing happened. He pulled the second cord. Nothing happened. He looked down. "I'll bet that damned station wagon won't be there either," he said. Nimitz laughed at his own stories, and then told the young men confidentially that his wife had warned him when he achieved flag rank that he would have to stop telling those awful stories. And he laughed again at himself. Then he was on another topic. The young officers had been out driving past Nanakuli and had seen the soldiers in the field, stationed in the Algaroba patches, out in no man's land. They said they were sorry for them. Nimitz frowned. "Soft. They're soft. They've got to learn to be hard. They're not having trouble. Only think they are. We're going to be here a long time, and they'd better get used to it." They talked shop a bit, Bassett suggesting that the Navy Department in Washington was taking away the play from the Pacific, with its Washington datelines, notes of origin. Nimitz smiled at that. "We've got bigger things to worry about," he said. "After we sink 4 more carriers, then you can publish anything you damned please." The talk continued, friendly, frank talk, until 9 in the evening. Then Nimitz pushed back his chair. "Let's get a breath of fresh air," he said. Spruance and the younger men followed the Admiral outside. They breathed deeply and looked up at the pale moon for a few moments, and listened to the pumps that were dredging mud from the harbour into Makalapa crater. "Sounds like rain on a tin roof, doesn't it, Ray?" asked Nimitz. Spruance nodded. "We'll sleep well with this going on." "Homie?" Spruance nodded again. The younger men sensed that it was time to go. As they left, Bassett asked one last question. "I understand you read a lot at night, sir?" Nimitz grinned. "Yes, I do. I read from 3 until 5 every morning. When do you sleep, sir? Well, I turn in at 10 and sleep till 3. Then I catch another wink from 5 till 0645. The young men turned, waved, and walked down the drive in the moonlight, Bassett saying to himself that here was his Admiral, a human, likeable, hearty, zestful, kindly man, the best of any flag officers I have ever met. And Nimitz went to bed. With his clear eyes, regular features, athletic figure, and square jaw, Raymond Ames Spruance was almost a motion picture representation of the perfect naval officer. He was saved from caricature by his shyness, his intellectuality, and his immense ability as naval strategist and tactician. This new Chief of Staff to Admiral Nimitz was precisely what a fleet commander would demand. He was agreeable without being obsequious, shy without being retiring, businesslike to a point of irritating visitors, and totally dedicated to the job at hand. As Chief of Staff, Spruance was responsible for organisation of all the detail of the command, and he was on top of it. He had always been on top of everything, it seemed, from the days of his youth, when he had not one but 2 appointments to the Naval Academy, having won competitive examinations in Indiana, where his family lived, and in New Jersey, where his grandmother lived. At the academy they called him Spru. He was 26th in his class academically, and totally undistinguished in the extracurricular activities of the midshipmen. He was so shy that as it came time to characterize him for the lucky bag, the class yearbook, the editors were hard put to find anything outstanding except that characteristic, and his devotion to duty. His class of 1907 was divided into 3 sections, and Spruance was actually graduated in the fall of 1906. He went to the battleship Iowa as a passed midshipman, served creditably but without distinction, was promoted to ensign in 1908, and promptly asked for special duty as a postgraduate student of electrical matters at the General Electric Company in Schenectady. Wireless was new, and that was what he studied. For the next few years, Spruance served in battleships and cruisers as a junior officer in engineering. His first command was the old Bainbridge DD-1 in the Asiatic Fleet at Olongapo in the Philippines. As the senior officer afloat, he was commander of the destroyer division, which included DDs 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. The Bainbridge, according to a shipmate, Carl Moore, was the first torpedo boat destroyer in the American fleet, a development from the old torpedo boats. She was 440 tons, with a speed of 28 knots, and she had 2 3-inch guns and 4 torpedoes aboard. She was powered by 4 boilers with reciprocating engines, reciprocating forced draft blowers. She was also a coal-burning, dirty, miserable little tub. 5 years earlier, Ensign Nimitz had served aboard her sister ship, DD-5, the Decatur. Matters had not changed very much since, at least not for the better. In the interim, the destroyers had earned a reputation as rough, tough ships. The officers, said Carl Moore, who was an ensign in those days, were dissolute, drunken, crooked, the darndest bunch of people you've ever seen, and demoralized completely by life in the Asiatic station. Several of them had Chinese aboard that weren't enlisted. They'd picked them up in Hong Kong or Canton or someplace, and they brought them down to the Philippines and wouldn't let them off the ship because they'd be arrested immediately if it were known. Spruance already had a reputation in the fleet as a quiet, solid officer who knew his way around. He was sent in for one task, to straighten out this bunch of roughnecks and bring the destroyer division back into the Navy. So bad were affairs that one night when Spruance moved the division to Cavite, the captain of Nimitz's old ship, the Decatur, was dead drunk in his bunk, and Spruance had to send Ensign Carl Moore over to move the ship. He was efficient, and he began whipping the division into line. Socially, in the Philippines, Spruance was a drag. His younger officers got him invited to picnics and sailing parties and dinners, but he could not shine. He was absolutely incompetent at small talk. Moore and the other junior, Ralph Haxton, insisted that Spruance accompany them on their jaunts, and little by little they broke him down. The girls called him Priscilla Prudence, but they did it behind his back. It was not too long before Spruance was actually enjoying the company of girls, but there was one difference. The others drank, sometimes to excess. Spruance did so only once. The morning after a big dinner party ashore, Ensign Moore found his commanding officer in bed with his mackintosh and sea boots still on. That was the one time. At Christmas 1913, Moore and Spruance went up to Baguio. They visited Igorot villages, and they walked and walked and walked. Moore was to remember how much they walked, not very many months after Spruance became Nimitz's chief of staff. To straighten up his destroyers, Spruance made it a practice while in port to eat each meal on a different ship, and soon had improved the food on all of them. He accompanied the swimming parties to the beaches, and soon had the men getting regular exercise in Subic Bay. In 1914, Spruance was transferred to a shore job at Newport News. His title was Assistant Inspector of Machinery, but soon he was supervising the electrical work aboard the new USS Pennsylvania, and when she was finished, it was not long before he went to her as Assistant Engineering Officer. Here, Lieutenant Commander Spruance met Lieutenant Richmond Kelly Turner, and they became good friends. Electricity was Spruance's specialty. He went to the New York Navy Yard as electrical superintendent. He was promoted to commander and went to London to supervise installation of electrical fire control systems on the ships of the 6th Battle Squadron. There he took transport duty as executive officer of the Agamemnon, and later was commander of the destroyer Aaron Ward. His division commander was Commander William F. Halsey, who wrote Spruance's fitness reports. "An able, bright destroyer commander," said Halsey of the younger man. Each of Halsey's fitness reports on Spruance was equally positive. Halsey called him one of the best naval officers with whom he had ever served, and Halsey could be very tough to please. Spruance moved back into engineering and electricity after destroyer duty and spent 3 years in Washington in the Bureau of Engineering. But he escaped typing and was again a destroyer commander in 1924. While so serving, Spruance received an official reprimand when a chief commissary steward played fast and loose with the naval regulations regarding mess expenditures. As captain of the ship, Spruance was responsible for the steward's peccadilloes. The reprimand went into his service jacket, where it very easily could have sat bleakly for years, to be brought up and examined by the selection board, and keep Raymond Spruance from becoming a flag officer. Even as a young officer, Spruance was a reader. His friends Moore and Haxton of the Bainbridge preferred to roister at night in Manila. Often Spruance could be found reading a book instead. He made a study of Philippine politics and economics in those days too, quite an unusual activity for a young naval officer in the Asiatic Fleet. And as he grew older, Spruance continued this intellectuality. He was a family man. In 1914, Spruance married Margaret Vance Dean of Indianapolis, his hometown. 2 children were born of the marriage. The boy, Edward, attended the Naval Academy and became a captain in the Navy. The girl, Margaret, married a naval officer, Gerard S. Bogart. In 1926, Spruance took the family to Newport because he had been selected to attend the senior course of the Naval War College. And here he studied strategy. After 10 months, he was graduated from the course and went to the Office of Naval Intelligence for a 2-year tour. He then became executive officer of the USS Mississippi of the Pacific Fleet. In 1931, Spruance was selected to become head of the tactical section, teaching at the War College. There he rejoined his friend Carl Moore, who became Spruance's assistant. They lived in houses 100 yards apart, and their families became friends. During this tour, Richmond Kelly Turner came up to the college to take the course. Turner proved himself a good tactician, but one with a temper. One day they were simulating a battle, and Turner was in command of a squadron of destroyers, fighting another squadron. Carl Moore was the umpire, and he knew how many shots were fired by Turner's destroyers and how many by the enemy, and, according to the board, what damage they had done. Turner and his opponent knew only the damage to their own ships, which they could figure from the position charts. Suddenly Moore turned to Turner. "All your ships are sunk," he said. "Oh, for Christ's sake!" shouted Turner in disgust, and he refused to believe it. Moore finally had to chase Turner off the board. "Then I indirectly just bawled the hell out of Turner," he said. The next day Turner came around and apologized. During this tour, Moore and Spruance decided they would take their wives up to northern New England in the fall to see the autumn leaves at the height of their golden glory. It was raining in Newport, but they thought the weather would be better farther north and inland, so they drove to Hanover, New Hampshire. They arrived just as the Dartmouth Holy Cross football game ended, and discovered that they could not even get up Hanover's main street to ask for accommodations at the Hanover Inn, and then they found that they could not find a place to stay in all the little town. Finally, they found tourist rooms at Plymouth, stayed overnight, and went on the next day. They drove up Mount Washington, where the others froze in their heavy coats, but Spruance seemed comfortable enough in his light raincoat. As they drove back down the mountain, Moore, Mrs. Moore, and Mrs. Spruance were thinking only of stopping at the bottom for a hot meal and a cup of coffee to assuage the pains of the rain and the sharp winds on top of Mount Washington. At the bottom of the mountain they found a little restaurant and went in. Moore ordered a warming meal, and so did the ladies. Spruance ordered a cream cheese and olive sandwich and a glass of milk. That was his lunch, a sandwich and a glass of milk, and he was not going to change his routine. In the house on Macalapa, Spruance developed other routines. He did not care much for liquor, but he was a connoisseur of coffee. When the American forces moved into the New Hebrides and New Caledonia, Spruance learned that those places were celebrated for their coffee. He had several bags of green beans sent up to Pearl Harbor to the house on the hill. There the houseboys took charge, except that Spruance supervised the roasting, the grinding, and the brewing of fresh ground coffee beans for breakfast in the mornings. The stuff was so strong that some tender souls, such as Admiral Nimitz, tried it once and never again. Spruance scoffed at such flowers, and each time an important visitor turned up, he would give him a cup. These attentions resulted in many a burned tongue, and many memories by visitors of their café clutches on Macalapa. Soon the coffee and the walks, and his reputation for integrity, began to make the Chief of Staff a legend, comparable to those of Nimitz and Halsey, among the men of the Pacific Fleet. It was the time of the Kona weather at Pearl Harbor. The offices in the submarine base were hot and sticky, the fans scarcely stirring the flies that traced tiny lines in the dust on top of the filing cabinets. Early in the still morning, the officers trooped down to the headquarters, each to his desk or cubicle. Nimitz moved into his office with the big steam pipe rising next to his chair. Spruance was nearby, in an office where he stood at his desk, a special one rigged for him. There was no chair in the office. Visitors came in, stated their business standing, and were quick to move on to some place more comfortable and congenial. Spruance was all business when he was in his office. Nimitz had a tendency to amble around headquarters in spare moments, dropping in to chew the fat with his officers. One day he might stop for 10 minutes at the operations office, pause in the door, and discuss affairs of the day. Or he might go to the public relations office and stop in the threshold, as if he were waiting for an invitation to come in. Then he would start talking. One day he stopped to talk to Commander Drake and Lieutenant Bassett, and they got to discussing the code names that were used at headquarters in talking about places and objectives in the Pacific. "Take Truk," said Nimitz, grinning a mild grin. "That should be called cojones." And that, of course, was because cojones was what Nimitz proposed to have the Japanese by one of those days in the future. The staff was still small and homogeneous, most of the staff officers still those holdovers from the Kimmel Command, who had by now adjusted themselves to the easygoing yet demanding ways of Admiral Nimitz. Without a visible exception, these officers admired their boss. His unruffled disposition, his thoughtfulness, even his stern admonitions when necessary, all endeared Nimitz to his staff. The war plans officer, his assistants, the aviation officer, gunnery officer, marine, intelligence communications, medical, supply, public relations, and all the rest had their separate duties, but in their general level of intense activity they were nearly all the same. In the morning the staff men came to headquarters to read the dispatches that concerned them, dispatches that had come in during the night. They read the papers, the Star Bulletin and the Advertiser. Then they got down to the task at hand. Perhaps a submarine was coming in that morning from patrol. The submarine squadron, Subron bandsmen then straggled down to the dock, lined up, and struck up their welcoming music. The sub's diesels sputtered and blew off blue smoke. The young captain warped her into the dock. Admiral English trotted down to the water's edge and skipped aboard, grinning from ear to ear, for when a sub came back, the patrol was never a failure. The public relations photographers came out and began snapping pictures. English disappeared down into the conning tower and listened to the stories of the boat's adventures in the loneliness of a Japanese sea. Or a warship would come in and moor, and the officers concerned would get into the big grey fleet motorboat and ride out into the harbour, over water still smeared with the oils of defeat. The launch would twist its way through the anti-torpedo nets and go alongside. The officer would climb the gangway, ask for the captain, and step into his cabin for a cup of coffee. Then, later that day, the captain would come ashore and pay his duty call on Admiral Nimitz, who would question him gently but thoroughly about his operations, what he had seen and done, and why. Perhaps a visiting captain, and certainly a flag officer, would be invited to attend the morning conference, made to feel a part of the Nimitz War in the Pacific. There would be lunch. Nimitz might be suffering from waistline trouble, and if so, he would go back to the house on Makalapa and rest for a time without eating, then get up a game of tennis or go back to the office. Or he might take a plunge in the pool beside the bow queue, where the Navy nurses giggled in their powder room. Nimitz was particularly allergic to the nurses. If he could have had his own way, there would have been no women at all in the war zone. Each time a nurse became pregnant and had to be sent home, the Nimitz quarters resounded with his views. The afternoon would be hot and sticky this August 1942. Nimitz might be asked for an interview by a correspondent or two. More were coming out almost weekly to join the force and don khaki uniforms with the green and white brassard. Nimitz would see them and tell a few stories, bragging about some of his men. The correspondents would go away pleased by their reception and glad to have seen the Admiral. But when they came to writing their stories, they found that Nimitz had really told them very little. At the end of the workday there would be a social hour, dinner, and then perhaps a movie in a small theatre where the air was like warm consommé, which Lieutenant Bassett suggested bottling and selling to the Campbell Soup Company. For Nimitz there might be a small informal dinner party, so that he could get to know some of his staff better and assure them, simply by his presence, of his approval. Or he would give a dinner in honour of some visiting flag officer, general, politician, or dignitary. After the movie it was back to the office to read the dispatches, as the duty yeoman moved from room to room, slamming the black-painted windows, shutting out the trade-wind clouds and the little breeze that blew up from the harbour. Every night it was almost the same, and here is Lieutenant Bassett's description, so it goes. Every night, 7 a week, and every day and every month. It's the near-front business of fighting a war. Just beyond the horizon, plus or minus 1,000 miles or so, the fleet is engaging an enemy, we'll say. Back here, the clatter of typewriters, the clangour of coding machines, the deep buzz of earnest conversation over plotting boards, the whisper behind partitions in secret chart rooms, the moving of pencils across aerographic maps, the drafting of memos that might mean victory or defeat. It's a gravely moving synthesis of activity. I like it, although at night and in the dull grey morning I sometimes curse it. I guess we'd better just wipe the sweat off our foreheads and dig in again, because, oh Christ, it's right, it is going to last a long, long time. That's how it was for the staff. For Nimitz there was the added burden of the terrible responsibility, and as August rolled around, the tension grew by the hour. As the day of the Tulagi-Guadalcanal invasion drew close, Nimitz half expected a Japanese raid on Hawaii or Midway, or both. He had sent 3 carrier task forces to the South Pacific, leaving only one to protect the Central Pacific. Task Force 1, the battleships, would move to Hawaii during August, but was not really ready for battle because it was short of screening ships and air cover. Air strength in Hawaii was inadequate to stop a raid because of the movement of planes to the South Pacific. Even the submarine offensive was suffering because the submarines were being employed around Truk and in the Aleutians. One trouble was that after Midway, those unfortunate remarks by 1 or 2 officers about the Japanese code had caused the Japanese Navy to change the codes. "We are no longer reading the enemy mail," the staff estimate of the situation on August 1st noted dolefully. "And today, August 1st, we must depend almost entirely on traffic analysis to deduce enemy deployment." The trouble was that Japan had so many possibilities. Her strategic situation was still so strong that Nimitz had no way of knowing what the enemy's next move would be. So, like the ensign Nimitz who had curled up on a cot on the deck of his stranded destroyer in 1908, Admiral Nimitz refused to waste time making wild guesses and got on with the business at hand. August 7th was D-Day at Tulagi, which was regarded as the key in the Solomons campaign. Again, Nimitz waited. While he waited, he turned considerable attention once again to the problem of naval air power. Hanson W. Baldwin, of the Naval Academy class of 1924, military editor of the New York Times, was seeking information for a book Secretary Knox was encouraging him to write on air power in a sea war, for Knox was hopeful that Baldwin would thus counteract the influence of Alexander de Seversky. But much more immediate and important was the appointment of Admiral Fitch as Commander of Naval Air Forces Pacific. He would be the responsibility for logistics, placement, and commands in the coming air war. How Nimitz felt about the Solomons invasion is only obliquely indicated, for one of his great attributes as a fleet commander and admiral was his total self-discipline. He did as his chiefs ordered, without complaint. By the summer of 1942, Nimitz had a new set of bosses, the Joint Chiefs of Staff. The line of command for the United States Navy then was President of the United States, Joint Chiefs of Staff, Commander-in-Chief, King, Commander-in-Chief, Fleet, Nimitz Pacific. King had been plumping for a South Pacific invasion since February, and in early July the Joint Chiefs, of which he was a member, had agreed on the Solomons campaign. They called it Operation Watchtower. Nimitz called it Operation Shoestring. Except for requests to King for all the material and weapons he could get, and frank warnings to Gormley and McCain that they were going to get very little, Nimitz did not have much to say about the strategy here. Once the decision was made by higher authority, Nimitz followed the old axiom of command, and he expected his subordinate commanders to do the same, with every possible bit of bravery and gallantry. The hurry-up nature of the Solomons operation was indicated in a letter Admiral Dremel wrote Nimitz late in July. The 1st Marine Division, which actually invaded the islands, was to be in the South Pacific by August. The 2nd and 3rd Marine Divisions were to be there by December. Fortunately, the 1st Marine Division had been training for several months, and the men were toughened up. The 9th Marine Regiment was still in Camp Pendleton at that point, and when they cleared out, the amphibious command would be practically out of business. But in the meantime, several of these Marine regiments due in the South Pacific in December had not yet begun amphibious training, and several Army regiments were also waiting. Dremel was confused, and no wonder. It was a matter of too far, too fast. But the war would not wait. For the invasion and the operations, Vice Admiral Gormley, as noted, was in overall command. Frank Jack Fletcher was in charge of Task Force 16, the expeditionary force, and Rear Admiral Lee Noyes was in charge of the Air Support Force, or carriers. Rear Admiral Thomas C. Kincaid had a task force that included the carrier Enterprise, whose captain was Arthur C. Davis, lately Nimitz's air officer, who had finally gotten the sea assignment he wanted. Also in this battle from the Nimitz staff were Captain Charles H. McMorris, commander of the cruiser San Francisco, and Captain Walter S. Delaney, commander of the cruiser New Orleans. McMorris had been operations officer for Kimmel and war plans officer for Nimitz. Delaney had been operations officer for Nimitz. All were being given the chance every naval officer wants, one that Nimitz had wanted himself, a battle command. Rear Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner was in command of the amphibious force, and Rear Admiral McCain had the land-based air. Submarine support was being given out of MacArthur's Navy, the Southwest Pacific Force, headed by Rear Admiral Charles A. Lockwood, Jr., the former naval attaché in London who had so itched to avenge the Pearl Harbor disaster. Lockwood's second in command was Captain Ralph W. Christie at Brisbane, a man most instrumental in development of the torpedo the American Navy was then using. These were fighting men. One of the least known of them, and perhaps the most aggressive of the lot, was Turner. Richmond Kelly Turner had come originally from Portland, Oregon. He was fifth in his Academy class of 1908. He had commanded a destroyer in 1913 and served in battleships during World War I. He had been ashore in ordnance work for 3 years and had trained as a naval aviator. He had commanded the aircraft squadron of the Asiatic Fleet in 1928 and had been in the plans section of the Bureau of Aeronautics from 1929 to 1931. After his course at the War College, he had served with Spruance on the staff there in the Tactical Division. Then he had taken command of the cruiser Astoria. In 1940, Kelly Turner had gone to the office of the Chief of Naval Operations as Director of the War Plans Division. He was rough and tough, as Carl Moore remembered him. Moore had come to the War Plans Division in the summer of 1939 as head of the Plans section, and when Admiral Turner came in October 1940, Moore was working on the plan called Rainbow-4, which had been assigned by the Joint Army-Navy Board. Turner looked through the work at hand and ordered Moore to work on Rainbow-5, which was the big Navy plan for the Pacific in particular. Moore agreed, but went back to finish Rainbow-4 first. 2 or 3 days later, Turner had come into Moore's office and chewed him out, as Moore had never been upbraided before. He ordered Moore to stop work on the 4 plan and also never to go to the War Department, where Moore had been working part of the time on his plan. Moore was shaken, but not so upset that he did not recognize Turner's abilities. Within a matter of weeks, Moore said, Turner had Admiral Stark, his boss, and the whole Joint Army-Navy Board swung around to his idea that the plan for the Pacific War was the most important. He was forceful, also pig-headed and determined, according to Moore. He was so violent in his arguments that other officers of all services would back down rather than quarrel with him. Whatever else might be said, Turner got things done, and that is what counted with Admiral King, his boss. Turner's method was to drive his subordinates and demand their best. No one seemed to care how he got the job done. Physically, he was prepared to work around the clock, and did so. He would beetle his brows, curse, and demand answers on short notice from his subordinates. This rough personality was not the best suited in the world to negotiations with army officers, and something had to give. It did give in February 1942. Turner was fired. Turner was upset, and King knew it. He did his best for this hot-tongued officer who had so much ability, so much drive, and so little control of his emotions. And thus it was that Turner was selected for the very difficult job of running the Navy's first amphibious assault of the war into Tulagi and Guadalcanal Island. On July 18th, Turner raised his flag in the transport Macaulay in Wellington. 8 days later, somehow, the expeditionary force was assembled in mid-ocean, 75 ships. On August 7th, this flotilla came moving around Cape Esperance, and the invasion of Guadalcanal began. The initial landings were relatively easy. A transport was lost, and 11 fighter planes and a dive bomber went down. But Vice Admiral Gunichi Mikawa of the Japanese Navy had been caught by surprise, and was only beginning to fight. Turner was having a difficult time unloading his transports on the narrow beaches, and he sensed that time was running short. It was. Admiral Mikawa set out with 7 cruisers and a destroyer, supported by the land-based air power of the Japanese-held islands nearby. Mikawa planned to rush in and torpedo the American ships lying north of Guadalcanal Island, cross the bay to Tulagi and smash the American ships lying south of that island, then turn to port and dash northeast to retire behind Little Savo Island. It was to be done at night. The Japanese were very confident of their abilities as night fighters at sea, and somewhat contemptuous of the American ability to fight at night. Turner had sent in landing craft from his 15 transports at Guadalcanal on the first day, and 11,000 Marines had gone ashore 4 miles east of Lunga Point. By the second day, the Marines had fought their way into ownership of the airstrip, the reason they were there. The Japanese had only about 2,000 troops on the island, most of them labourers, and they did not put up much resistance. Tulagi had been tougher. The Japanese had fighting men there in number, and the going was rough. Nevertheless, Tulagi was secured on August 8th, and it appeared that the invasion was a success. But the Japanese under Admiral Mikawa were ready to dispute the case. The battle that followed was historic, and so complex that Samuel Eliot Morison devoted 48 pages to it in Volume 5 of his History of United States Naval Operations in World War II, and later Commodore R.W. Bates of the Naval War College wrote an entire volume on the subject for the use of senior naval officers. Both studies indicated that Savo Island was an example of how not to fight a battle. First of all, after the Japanese began ploughing down on the force, Admiral Fletcher took his carriers away from the area. Morison says he seemed determined to take no risks, having lost Lexington at Coral Sea and Yorktown at Midway. Then, the Sound between Tulagi and Guadalcanal was divided into 4 sectors. Australian Rear Admiral Viac Crutchley was in charge of the southern force of cruisers and destroyers. Captain Frederick Reefcoal took the northern force of cruisers and destroyers. Rear Admiral Norman Scott had a force of cruisers at the eastern side, and a pair of destroyers covered the west. Unluckily, Admiral Crutchley was called aboard Admiral Turner's flagship, as the Japanese were steaming in at 26 knots, and there he was when his mixed Australian-American force was challenged to battle. The Japanese came in through the destroyers, the weakest point. They passed by the destroyer Blue, which did not see them, and the Jarvis, which did not see them either. She had been damaged in the air attacks of the day before. Then the Japanese were in among the Allied fleet, having achieved complete surprise. Above the Allies, float planes dropped flares, and the Japanese began to shoot. The first ship sunk was the Canberra, the Australian cruiser, her captain killed. The destroyer Patterson was hit next and badly damaged. The cruiser Chicago was struck by a torpedo, and part of her bow was knocked off. Then the Japanese turned and rushed across the bay to hit Reefcoal's force. The cruiser Astoria was next, smashed by shellfire. Then came the cruiser Quincy, which capsized, and finally the cruiser Vincennes, which also capsized and sank. The destroyer Ralph Talbot was badly hit in the fight, but managed to make Tulagi. The Japanese retired, fearing the American aircraft carriers, which were nowhere about, and having suffered only minor damage to their cruisers. When the news of the battle reached Fletcher's force at about 0300, Captain Forrest Sherman of the Wasp asked Admiral Noyes for permission to take some destroyers and move in at high speed to protect the Turner force, because Sherman's pilots were trained in night operations. But Noyes would not even transmit the request to Fletcher. At dawn, the Japanese fully expected a carrier plane attack, but it never came. The only Japanese loss was that of the cruiser Kako that second day, sunk by the American submarine Ep.4. At Pearl Harbor, the dispatches that came in were more confusing than anything else. Nimitz knew he had suffered serious losses. He gathered from Gormley's requests for more aircraft that there was not enough air cover in the Solomons, but there was nothing he could do about it. He was distressed too, because at this time the destroyer Perkins damaged a propeller in the South Pacific, and the Morris and Mustin collided during night exercises with Task Force 1 off Hawaii. Although the damage to these DDs was apparently slight, said the estimate, it further depletes our DD strength at a time when they cannot be spared without embarrassment. One problem was the faulty intelligence, which existed since the security violation that had caused the Japanese to change their naval code. Nimitz did not know where the Japanese carrier force was located, and this bothered him more than anything else in the days just after Savo Island. 10 days after the battle, Nimitz still did not know what had happened, but he was beginning to get the idea from Gormley's dispatches that the outcome was serious. He was not very happy. Our losses were heavy, and there is still no explanation of why. The enemy seems to have suffered little or no damage. The food situation there has not yet been cleared up. In fact, since the initial landing, not much of anything has been done by our task forces, and the air under General MacArthur has been of little help except for reconnaissance. Now began the long and grueling Battle of Guadalcanal on the ground and at sea. Despite his own orders, Nimitz was becoming queasy about Frank Jack Fletcher. On August 21st, Fletcher sent a message saying he must withdraw to fuel on August 24th. Sinkpack's comment was succinct. "There is plenty of fuel in the vicinity of his force." That same day, Nimitz heard that 2 Japanese forces were descending on the Solomons, and he knew that an all-out attempt was going to be made to recapture the area. Fletcher apparently did not have that word. On August 23rd, he sent Admiral Noyes and the Wasp to a fueling rendezvous far away. Meanwhile, the Japanese carriers were fueling on the run, coming in. So the Americans had 2 carriers at hand instead of 3. The Japanese had 2 fleet carriers, a light carrier, an escort carrier, and a seaplane carrier, plus battleships, cruisers, destroyers, and auxiliary ships. In the action that came, the Americans showed that they were learning new carrier techniques. The carrier planes were for the first time controlled by vectoring, that is, by direction from a combat intelligence center that saw the positions of planes and ships on radar. Fierce fighting on Guadalcanal. And when Forrestal returned to Washington, he made strong representations for reinforcements in the South Pacific and for changes in the air establishment. Guadalcanal had looked like a pushover until the Battle of Savo Island. But in the second week of August, General Vandergrift knew the struggle was going to be a long, hard one. Admiral Turner had been forced to retire with the transports, and that meant the Marines were alone, while the Japanese, for all practical purposes, controlled sea and air around the island. The Marines had to hold the island and complete the airfield for the use of fighters and bombers. The Japanese were determined to reinforce the handful of troops they had left on Guadalcanal and retake the island. On August 17th, troops were landed at Tassafaronga. The next day, 1,000 troops were landed by destroyer near Taivu Point. The first brutal action was fought at the Tanaru River, and here the Marines faced a banzai charge led by sword-waving officers. They learned the Japanese tricks. It was a night attack, launched at 0130 on the morning of August 21st. The Japanese came in, bayonets fixed, shouting and screaming. They tossed grenades over the heads of the Americans to make them think they were surrounded. They charged into and overran positions. They lay down and pretended to be dead, then rose up behind the Marines who passed them by with rifle and grenade to kill. But the Marines held them off that night and counterattacked the next morning, closing the Japanese into a palm grove on the east bank of the river. In this battle, the Marines learned never to trust a body unless it was discernibly dead. 35 Marines were killed and 75 were wounded, but the ratio was very low. 1,000 Japanese died. The pattern of the Pacific War encounters was set here. The Japanese did not surrender, they fought to the death, and by and large the Marines were satisfied with that arrangement. The deep jungle and the mud and mosquitoes were as much the enemy as the Japanese. It was a new kind of war, even for the Marines, and they quickly learned to improvise. One night, for example, Vandergrift sent a message to Pearl Harbor asking for 100 gross of a medical article, stipulating the number. The message arrived at Pearl Harbor around 0300 in the morning, and the communications watch officer looked up the number. Then he went rushing to wake up Lieutenant Commander Lamar, Nimitz's aide. What Vandergrift wanted were contraceptives. Contraceptives in the middle of a battle. What in the devil could Vandergrift be thinking of? Lamar woke, put on his clothes, and went up to Nimitz's house on Macalapa to the little hall bedroom where Fleet Surgeon Jondro was sleeping. The surgeon shook himself awake and got up to investigate. He came back to report that there were not 100 gross of contraceptives, 14,400 on all Oahu at that moment. Perplexed, Lamar awakened Admiral Nimitz and stated the problem to him. To Nimitz the light dawned at once. Vandergrift is probably going to use these on the rifles of his Marines to keep out the rain, he said, which is part of the reason that Nimitz was an admiral. Eventually the Marines got their contraceptives, but it took a little time. One of Kelly Turner's serious problems was the confusion in supply and logistics. The transports came in and spent their time around the beach trying to unload and dodging attacks. They would move out perhaps still half-loaded as night fell and the Japanese held the waters, and then come back by day. 2 weeks after the Guadalcanal landings, Turner was apologizing to Marine General Vandergrift for what seemed like neglect. We have been greatly handicapped in fixing up cargoes because we could not find out what material most of the ships still had on board. Transport quartermasters were in most cases landed with you, and we had to dig information out by patient ship-to-ship canvass of cargo. Some of the captains did not even have copies of the loading plan, and did not know what was left, because the transport quartermasters took with them the only lists of the cargoes. The first order of business when Nimitz next met with King in San Francisco on September 7, 1942, was the matter of aviation. It was apparent that carrier and land-based aviation was assuming an ever more important role in this island war. Forrestal and Artemus Gates had been pressing for a more important position in the Pacific Command for aviators than that of aviation officer, and Nimitz had accepted the idea. Rear Admiral Towers, Naval Aviator No. 2, would become commander of aircraft of the Pacific Fleet. Nimitz welcomed this coming of an air officer, which would relieve his staff of some of the detail of managing the airplanes. So it was decided that Towers would become a vice admiral and take the Pearl Harbor job. Fitch, who held that job, would go down to the South Pacific to run air affairs there, and McCain, who was in the South Pacific, would go to Washington to take Towers' old job as chief of the Bureau of Aeronautics. Towers was only partially pleased with this program. His move was fine, for he had visions of becoming the super admiral of the fleet, occupying a job something like Yamamoto's in the Japanese Navy, with a bevy of carriers under him and battleships and cruisers and destroyers to support the air forces. He did not, however, want McCain in Washington in his old job. He wanted one of his own boys there. He recommended Ramsey, Davison, or Radford for the post. McCain was not qualified for administrative air work or procurement, he said. Nonetheless, McCain was chosen. Halsey was finally recovered from his illness after a long siege that included many weeks in a Virginia hospital. He was itching to get back into action, and Nimitz was eager to have him, even though there were problems. Halsey had the rank of Vice Admiral because he had been the senior air officer in the Pacific when he left in June. But so much had occurred in the days since June that two other officers were really in superior positions: Gormley as commander of the South Pacific, and Towers, who was to be chief air officer. It was a tribute to Halsey that King and Nimitz so respected him that they agreed to let him keep his 3 stars, yet be used as a task force commander. Another command problem was presented by the strong-willed Admiral Theobald in the Aleutians. He had been quarrelling with Generals Buckner and Butler over many matters, and King was so annoyed that he had sent Vice Admiral Freeman up north to make an investigation. Freeman came back with a clean bill of health for Theobald, but that did not change the fact that Theobald was stuck in a backwash of the war, or solve the problems of Army-Navy cooperation in the Aleutians. A few days earlier, Nimitz had moved into a new headquarters up the hill from Ford Island. The building and swimming pool cost nearly $2 million, and he ordered his staff to figure that cost out in terms of ships and planes it would have supplied, so they would always remember what the war was all about. On moving, Nimitz installed the wartime souvenirs and bric-a-brac he was collecting there, including a sign that warned his callers, "Is the proposed operation likely to succeed? What might be the consequences of failure? Is it in the realm of practicability of material and supplies?" That sign warded off a lot of foolish ideas, as did another much gaudier decoration. Nimitz told King about a visit in August from Lieutenant Colonel Evans Carlson, the head of the Marine Raider Battalion, and Major James Roosevelt, his second in command. They had brought Nimitz a bloody samurai sword, which Nimitz promptly hung up on the wall beneath another sword, which had been carried by one of the Japanese pilots shot down in the Pearl Harbor raid. But now, in San Francisco, Nimitz gave the sword to King, who presented it to the Naval Academy Museum. He also gave a captured machine gun, which went to the Marine Corps Museum. King and Nimitz were having troubles with General MacArthur, and they discussed the best methods of getting along. They were having more troubles with logistics. On his return from the Pacific, Forrestal had spoken of this problem, and Nimitz asked that Admiral Calhoun, his Service Corps officer, should have a representative in Washington. It was agreed, but King did note that the supply situation in general was a matter for the desk of the Paymaster General, who was supposed to be Fleet Supply Officer. In the talk about personnel, the name of Fletcher came up, and King said he wanted him in Washington for a couple of weeks of temporary duty, which meant he wanted to look Fletcher over. They talked very seriously about the problems at Guadalcanal. The day dispositions, they said, were all right. The night dispositions looked bad, and King asked questions that could not then be answered. Was the best use made of forces available? Specifically in the question of Savo Island, why were flag officers absent from both groups of cruisers? When Crutchley, Turner and Vandergrift had met on Turner's flagship that night, all three officers were half sick with fatigue. Why had no consideration been given to this problem of fatigue? And what about Turner's retirement to cover under Gormley during the Japanese raids, leaving Vandergrift to hold out by himself? Was the surprise attack at Savo Island the result of inefficiency? Anyhow, why were not steps taken to keep the Japanese from getting in? Nimitz talked about the tactical decisions made, and at the end of the discussion the two admirals agreed on one general thesis. The overall responsibility was Gormley's. Turner was Gormley's immediate representative. Final judgment on the fault would be withheld until receipt of completed reports. On the second day of this King-Nimitz meeting, the two admirals got down to the problems of public relations and press dispatches. They were not very happy with General MacArthur's treatment of press matters, because it was obvious to them both that he was releasing as news some materials from secret dispatches. Nimitz complained that he was bedeviled by reports at Pearl Harbor, and that he wanted Elmer Davis, the director of the Office of War Information, to know that he considered any release of war news to the press meant he was giving it directly to the enemy. King was brusque. He fought that battle every day, he said. They came back again to the problems in the South Pacific, the looseness of the operations, the bad planning in refueling, the delay in setting up a new cruiser task force, Task Force 64, and the surprise attack at Savo Island. With this problem pressing on his mind, Nimitz returned to Pearl Harbor to learn that the Japanese were building up to another major effort to capture Guadalcanal. Major General Kiyotake Kawaguchi staged such an assault on September 12th, and it gave Vandergrift some anxious hours. 3 days later, the carrier Wasp was sunk by a Japanese submarine. The battleship North Carolina took a torpedo, which forced her out of action for the moment, and so did the destroyer O'Brien. At this time came another mild harassment. Lieutenant General Delos Emmons of the Army was commander of Hawaii, and Nimitz got on very well with him. Emmons had just returned from a trip to Brisbane, where MacArthur had his headquarters, and had come back full of MacArthur strategy, which he was eager to pass on to Nimitz, as he is a thorough student of strategy and has been in direct contact for months with the Japanese. So Emmons wrote Nimitz a letter of good advice. MacArthur was very pessimistic about Guadalcanal, Emmons said. Emmons had asked him what could be done. The best thing, MacArthur had said, was to base the British Indian fleet in Australia, where it would come under MacArthur's command. The British fleet would then be able to reinforce Gormley and carry out its own mission. Nimitz had best look out too, said MacArthur, because the Japanese were certain to attack Hawaii in great strength in the near future. It was possible that the attack would come while there was little naval protection there before the Solomons could be won. On the other hand, MacArthur had soothed, he thought the Japanese would wait until they had isolated the Marine Division in the Solomons before taking on Hawaii. With an almost straight face, Nimitz sent a copy of the letter to King. While I cannot accept MacArthur's estimate of the Pacific situation, nor Emmons's estimate of MacArthur and the Pacific situation, I believe that you should know what is in the minds of our high army command. As to himself, we are far from being downhearted, Nimitz added. On the contrary, we view the future with optimism and anticipation. But if Nimitz was optimistic, the same could not be said of all the men of the ships that were fighting the attrition and disease in the South Pacific, or the Navy and Marine flyers who risked their necks hour after hour. Morale was low in the South Pacific, and Nimitz was not quite sure what must be done to set it right and get the operation there moving more quickly. As Nimitz pondered this problem, He was cheered by Halsey's coming to Pearl Harbor a few days later. The grinning, bouncing Halsey stepped in to help out with the air commander's duties until Towers arrived. In a most energetic manner. That's how Nimitz described Halsey's work. Towers was spending his last few days in Washington, trying desperately to get to see King and have his air captains promoted to flag rank before he moved away from the seat of power. But he was unsuccessful, he noted ruefully. He was more successful in another request. He asked that Forrest Sherman be made available to him as Chief of Staff when he took over as Commander of Aircraft in the Pacific. Lucky for Sherman, for the captain who loses his ship, the carrier Wasp, no matter the gallantry or the cause, runs the serious risk of being put on the beach and far away from the action. Sherman was being moved up instead to a job of great importance, even if it was a staff job. Nimitz was agreeable. He had more important things on his mind at that juncture, for he was just getting ready to make an inspection trip to the South Pacific to see if he could get to the bottom of the fleet's troubles there. Had he seen the current issue of Collier's, he might not have been so happy with Towers or his coming. Collier's had long prided itself on its air-mindedness. It had offered the Collier Air Trophy and supported aviation actively for many years. At this point, Collier's lamented editorially that it had taken Towers so long to move into a command post. It shows in the experience of one man why we are not winning the war faster. There was a very definite tendency on the part of some air enthusiasts to believe the airplane and its auxiliaries were the only weapons that counted. Not all airmen were so single-minded. McCain and Fitch, for example, were naval officers first, then airmen, and they did not belong to the group of young Turks, led by Towers, who hoped to take over the Navy. On September 24th, Nimitz and members of his staff left Pearl Harbor and flew to Palmyra to confer with the returning McCain. Also present at the meeting were Colonel Pfeiffer, the Marine officer, and Captain Ralph Ofstie, the aviation officer of SINCPAC. Nimitz talked about various air problems. He wanted McCain's advice on the use of the New Zealand Air Force, which was itching for action. Nimitz wanted to feed their pilots into American squadrons because he did not have the planes to provide them with their own material. Then, knowing he was going south, he asked McCain, "What shall I look into down there?"